Everyone on Briar's End Plantation said Josiah Reed could hear tomorrow, breathing in the cane. They were wrong. Josiah did not hear the future. He built it. Quietly, carefully, for 14 years. And for one terrible night. In St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, where the summer air hung wet as a sheet, and the sugar fields cut hard lines through the earth, Josiah Reed had become something no white family in that parish could explain, and therefore could not resist. He was a black enslaved man with silver beginning at his temples, a voice that never needed to rise, and a habit of looking at people until their own secrets seemed to shift under their skin. The Voss family called him a reader of signs. Their neighbors called him the Cane Prophet. Women came to his narrow room behind the mule shed and watched him spread river shells, peach pits, ribbon, and ash across a table, as if heaven itself had sent him a private alphabet. But Josiah's real talent was not mysticism. It was attention. Long before Gideon Voss pulled him from the cane rows and installed him as the plantation's private seer, Josiah had learned that survival depended on reading men faster than they could strike. He learned the meaning of a boot step, the mood inside a slammed door, the difference between a drunk overseer looking for an excuse and one looking for blood. His mother had taught him plants when he was a boy. Which roots soothed fever? Which leaves quieted pain? Which bitter things the earth kept for darker purposes? She told him knowledge was the one possession slavery could not register on a ledger. So he kept it. All of it. When a bookkeeper's mule snapped a trace and dragged him through the yard, after Josiah warned him not to hitch that animal in wet heat, people called it a vision. When a neighboring planter ignored Josiah's advice and lost a shipment after sending it downriver on a day of rising current and rotten rope, people called that a vision too. They never saw the full shape of what Josiah did. Sometimes he simply noticed what pride had made invisible. Sometimes he gave disaster the smallest possible push. A frightened animal, a delayed message, a misplaced tool. Fate, he learned, often needed only a fingertip. By 1845, Gideon Voss understood one thing clearly. Fear could be monetized. So Josiah stopped cutting cane. 3 days a week, he sat in the dark cabin beside the service yard and received those who wanted tomorrow translated into language they could bear. On Mondays, the Voss family came with headaches, debts, marriages, pregnancies, rivalries, and vanity. On Wednesdays, enslaved people from Briar's End and neighboring places came under one excuse or another, some for warning, some for comfort, some to pass along what they had heard in kitchens, stables, wash yards, and carriage sheds. White collars arrived in polished carriages, pretending skepticism all the way up the drive and reverence all the way back down it. Gideon Voss took the money. Josiah took the information. That was the arrangement. Only one of them understood the full value of it. He learned which planter was drowning in loans, which merchant cheated his books, which wife dosed herself to sleep, which son could be steered with flattery, which daughter cried in locked rooms, which overseer stole from stores and blamed it on the enslaved, which guest would drink anything poured into the proper crystal glass if the room was watching. He memorized everything, and because absolute usefulness is a kind of camouflage, he grew more powerful each year. Mistress Eleanor Voss began consulting him twice a week once her nerves started failing her. Her hands were always cold. Her voice always trembled just a little at the edges. She believed Josiah could sense illness before it arrived, and Josiah rarely disappointed her. Sometimes he reassured her, because reassurance made people dependent. Sometimes he warned her away from dangers she had already invited into her own life, and let his accuracy deepen the spell. Gideon Voss consulted him on crop timing, sugar contracts, labor purchases, parish alliances. Their son Edwin came to him about horses, gambling, women, and duels he was too frightened to admit he feared. Their youngest, Anna, came only a few times. She had gentler eyes than the rest of them, and the powerless kindness of someone raised inside evil without ever being allowed to stop it. There were others in the house as well. Gideon's widowed sister, Celia, who heard insult in every laugh. Old Mrs. Voss, who watched Josiah with the dry suspicion of someone too sharp to fully believe in miracles, but too frightened to stop using them. Guests, suitors, lawyers, clergy, speculators. They all carried themselves into his room. They all wanted certainty. They all paid for it in confession. The enslaved people at Briar's End learned something else about Josiah over time. He did not waste his position. If a field hand was about to be sold because an overseer had invented a theft, Josiah sometimes found a way to redirect blame. If a woman close to labor was about to be sent to the lower fields, Gideon Voss might suddenly hear that trouble followed any work forced under a waning moon. If a brutal driver was laid up by mysterious weakness for a week, nobody asked too many questions. By then, the parish already believed the reader's warnings traveled with consequences. That made Josiah more than useful. It made him trusted from both directions. Trust was the material he had spent 14 years curing like lumber in dry shade. And he might have kept curing it forever, if Briar's End had left his family alone. His wife Miriam worked in the laundry. His son Isaiah handled horses with such care that even white men complimented him without meaning to. And his daughter Naomi, quick-eyed, narrow-shouldered, impossible not to love, was 14 in the spring of 1859, and already skilled enough with a needle that Eleanor Voss had begun keeping her in the big house for fine mending. That was when the line broke. It happened on an afternoon that looked harmless. White sky, heavy air, cicadas screaming in the oaks. Gideon Voss sent for Josiah outside the regular consultation days, which told him at once the matter was bad. Inside the study stood Gideon, sweating through his collar, and a visitor from New Orleans named Lucien Marchand, with city gloves, polished boots, and the smile of a man who had made peace with every rotten thing inside himself. Gideon did not circle the subject. He had debts. Marchand had cash, and Naomi had been sold. Not to a seamstress house, not to a hotel, not to any lie worth dressing up. Sold south into that other market, the one everybody knew and nobody with power ever named plainly unless they were buying. For a moment the room did not move. Josiah heard the words. He understood them. But the understanding entered his body like winter water, first numb, then unbearable. He looked at Gideon Voss, the man who had grown wealthier under his guidance, the man whose profits had risen because Josiah had seen rot before it spread and danger before it flowered, the man who had fed off his mind for 14 years and still believed he could strip his child from him as if removing a chair from one room to another. Marchand asked, almost amused, whether the famous reader saw anything around the bargain, and something old in Josiah finally stood up. He turned toward the visitor first. "I see profit reaching for you," he said, "but I see it with blood on its cuffs." Then he looked at Gideon Voss. "Before summer ends," he said, 16 people in this house and around your table will die before sunrise. And when they fall, no prayer in Louisiana will mistake it for mercy." Marchand laughed. Gideon did not. Maybe some buried part of him knew Josiah had never sounded like that before. Naomi was taken at dawn. Gideon stayed in his office. Eleanor took to her bed with smelling salts. Edwin avoided the yard entirely. Anna cried where she thought no one could hear her. And Josiah, after watching the carriage roll beyond the live oaks, went back to his cabin, lifted the loose board beneath the cot, and uncovered the years he had never admitted he was saving for war. Wrapped cloth packets, dried cuttings, small stoppered bottles. A private language of knots, scratches, and placement marks only he could read. He did not rush. Rage that hurries makes mistakes. Grief that learns the clock becomes strategy. The Voss family's August candle supper had been held every year since Gideon's father first expanded the place. It was the proudest night on the plantation calendar. A long table, lanterns in the trees, musicians near the open windows, sugarmen and bankers and neighboring families drinking to harvest, profit, and the illusion of permanence. Josiah had seen that supper 14 times. He knew who attended, who drank what, who moved where after the first toast, which servants worked the gallery, which sideboard remained unwatched when music drew eyes away. If a house like Briar's End was ever going to be broken from within, it would be on a night when its owners gathered everyone they trusted inside arm's reach. So that was the night he chose. Not because it was convenient, because it was symbolic. They had sold his daughter as business. He would answer in public accounting. The weeks between Naomi's sale and the supper became the most disciplined work of Josiah's life. He spread the prophecy slowly, the way smoke enters fabric. First, Eleanor heard it in private and carried it, shaking, into the house. Then Gideon demanded details and received them. Then Edwin came with anger and left with fear hidden inside contempt. Then visiting planters asked what cloud hung over Briar's End, and Josiah told them only that the night of August 21st had already darkened in his sight. He never shouted, never embellished. He delivered doom with the exhausted calm of a man burdened by certainty. That made it stick. Soon the whole parish was repeating the count. 16 dead before sunrise. A few invitees found reasons not to attend. Enough still came. They always do. Because when human beings hear a warning, half of them run. The other half lean closer. Josiah fed the dread in smaller ways, too. Eleanor's hands began to tremble more often. Old Mrs. Voss lost her appetite. Edwin suffered dizzy spells after drink. Gideon woke one night with his heart racing so violently he thought death had come early. These were not final blows. They were rehearsals. Each symptom made the prophecy feel less like rumor and more like weather already turning overhead. At the same time, Josiah prepared the only futures he still wanted to preserve. He told Miriam when to be ill. He told Isaiah to keep 2 horses ready and a satchel buried near the north fence. He told 3 trusted people in the quarters that when the house erupted, they were to run, not rescue. White terror would seek black bodies to blame the second it could stand upright again. Survival would belong to those already moving. By the time August arrived, Briar's End was living inside a sentence Josiah had spoken. And still the Voss family refused to cancel the supper. That was the cruel brilliance of class pride. Gideon Voss would rather dine with doom than let the parish say fear had ruled his house. Eleanor wanted to cancel, then wanted not to seem weak. Edwin called the whole matter superstition and kept drinking through his nerves. Celia said nothing and watched candles burn down in daylight, moved like someone already grieving a room full of living people. On the morning of August 21st, 1859, Josiah rose before dawn. The house was already in motion. Servants polishing silver, cooks running hot and angry, lantern glass cleaned, linen shaken out, music stands carried in. The whole plantation preparing beauty for slaughter. Josiah moved through it as he always had, visible, forgettable, necessary. A word to the kitchen, a look at the sideboard, a hand near the tonic tray, a brief stop in the flower room, a pause behind the pantry door. Nothing dramatic, nothing that, standing alone, would have looked like the hinge of history. At dusk, the guests came. Neighboring sugarmen, a parish banker and his son, Colonel Beauregard from downriver with his wife, Lucien Marchand from New Orleans, sleek and satisfied, as if the world had never once denied him a hunger. 16 marked souls in all, once the family was counted into the sum. Lanterns glowed gold across the gallery. The musicians began. Crystal flashed. Laughter rose. And Briar's End turned luminous in the exact way doomed places sometimes do, as if ruin prefers to arrive at its most beautifully dressed. The first collapse came during the second toast. Not a scream, just a pause, a glass slipping, a chair scraping hard across the floorboards. Then a body pitched sideways and struck the runner. Conversation broke in half. Somebody called for water. Somebody else called for air. Eleanor Voss stood too quickly and nearly fell herself. Colonel Beauregard pressed both hands to his ribs, as if something inside him had started folding. And in that instant, the prophecy took control of the room. Because no one there thought first of a man. They thought of fate. That was Josiah's masterpiece. Panic came exactly as he had pictured it, not in one wave, but in layers. People rushing to help the first victim while ignoring the harm already working through themselves. Guests insisting it was the oysters, then the heat, then bad brandy, then a curse, then God. Gideon Voss demanding order while his own face lost color. Edwin shouting for riders. Eleanor reaching for the very tonic she believed steadied her. Marchand cursing the servants while wiping sweat from his mouth with trembling fingers. Josiah moved through the confusion like a pallbearer no one had summoned. He brought cloths. He named symptoms. He told them what hour it was. He reminded them, in a voice that could have passed for sorrow, that he had warned them this night would close with 16 dead. By the time the nearest doctor was sent for, the house had already become a trap built out of belief. Gideon caught Josiah by the sleeve once, hard enough to crease the cloth. "You said 16, he whispered. "Can it be stopped?" Josiah looked at him for a long moment. Not now. And that was the truest reading he had ever given. Midnight took the old mother and the banker's boy. 1 o'clock took Eleanor, then Edwin, Marchand, who died on the gallery steps clawing at the rail and staring at Josiah with the raw disbelief of a man learning too late that money had never bought him immunity. 3 o'clock took Gideon Voss in the room where he kept his ledgers. Others followed in rooms, chairs, hallways, guest chambers, on carpets soaked with spilled wine, lamp oil, and the mess the body makes when dignity fails it. By dawn, 16 people were dead. The music had long since stopped. The lanterns were burning out. The August air smelled of sugar, smoke, fear, and the sour remains of a house that had watched its own authority collapse body by body. A few survived. Anna Voss survived, stunned into a silence that looked older than her years. 2 guests survived because they had eaten little and left the table early. Celia survived because Josiah, after counting and recounting the number, had decided one witness inside the bloodline was more useful than one more corpse. Let memory live where arrogance once lived. When the sheriff and the doctor finally came, Briar's End already had its explanation waiting. The prophecy. The whole parish knew it. The guests had heard it. The family had lived beneath it for weeks. 16 dead before sunrise. People searched for spoiled food, bad air, cursed water, summer fever, divine wrath, anything but the mind of the man they had trained themselves not to imagine as the architect of anything grander than obedience. Josiah answered questions in the same grave tone he had used for years. He had seen the disaster. He had warned them. He had watched it unfold. That was all. And because slavery depends on the fantasy that the enslaved are simple, the truth walked directly past the investigators and was never properly seen. Briar's End was broken up within months. Land sold, silver sold, horses sold, people sold. That last fact would have made the ending unbearable if Josiah had not planned for it too. Isaiah ran that same night with the girl he loved and never came back. Miriam vanished into parish confusion and, by one whispered report, made it west during the war. And Josiah himself, sold to a dealer in New Orleans after the disaster, disappeared before winter. Some said he died in the swamp. Some said rivermen carried him north under sacks of feed. Some said the same man who could write death into a supper room could surely write himself out of bondage too. Years later, under another name in another city, he worked with soil and roots and kept mostly to himself. He helped sick people when he could. He searched for Naomi until searching became the shape of his life. He never found her. That is the wound no vengeance closed. So if you want this story to end neatly, it does not. 16 people died. A father remained broken. A daughter remained gone. And history, as it often does, remembered the spectacle before it remembered the theft that caused it. But the truth inside the story is harder to kill. They called Josiah Reed a reader of fate, because that let them keep their world intact. It is easier for power to believe in mystery than to admit that the man pouring its water, carrying its secrets, and listening beside its doors might also be the sharpest strategist in the parish. Josiah's gift was never prophecy. It was seeing exactly how the powerful expose themselves when they mistook dependence for ownership. And on one hot August night in Louisiana, after 14 years of being underestimated, he gave them the future they had earned.